another episode of Blam Blam Truckers. I am one of your hosts, Beas. I am not Beas. He is over there.
I'm Beas. I'm your other host. Frankly,
We are... Go ahead.
nothing. I was just going to make a joke. You can decide who's the good-looking one.
It's this guy right here. Cap. Steve Rogers.
America's butt. Anyway, do you want to intro us in, or shall I intro us in?
We're just two college buddies who have stayed friends over several decades at this point.
A quarter of a century.
I know. I feel old.
Hi.
I feel old every day.
I don't.
But we just decided that all of our conversations that we had offline might be good to put online. So
Figured other people might enjoy what we're doing here. Talking about what we love about geek culture for the most part. Once in a while we bring other modern news and stuff into it, but trying to keep a positive spin means we don't get to critique as much as we would normally do. But today we're going to be doing a little bit of critiquing, because George Lucas ruined my childhood, or, in modern parlance, Disney has ruined my child. Warner Brothers has ruined my Sony has ruined my child. Nobody ruined your childhood. Well, maybe if you had a lousy childhood, you did have a ruined childhood. I'll grant you that. But if you had a good childhood, and then somebody comes out with a new version or an addition to something you enjoyed as a kid, it doesn't ruin your childhood. It just adds something to the story that you didn't like. Which, boy, do we have experience with that, huh?
Oh, yeah.
But it's okay. You don't have to like everything they put out. They're not your characters. It's all right. Took me a while to accept that, because the stories weren't consistent, and that bothered me. But I kind of wanted to tell the story of the first time my childhood was ruined. It was when I was a child. And people talk about the whole, oh, you ruined my childhood. It happened to me as a kid in 1987. Now, we've talked about this in the Lost episodes. I don't know if we've brought it up since then. The Lost episodes that hopefully will eventually be posted. Have we been doing this for over a year already?
Got a couple months to go.
Oh. So we've been doing this for about 10 months, and 10, 12 months, and 10, 8 months? I don't know. So we've been doing this for a while, and we do not have all of our episodes up because, well, the old format didn't work that well for it, honestly. And getting them edited took a while, and they didn't all get posted. So they're getting posted slowly, and that's okay. This new format allows us to post a couple of times a week with shorter videos, which I hope you guys are enjoying. But one of the things that I get on my high horse about is the death of Marvel Comics after they sold to Revlon, and what's his name there? Jim Shooter got fired within a year. What Jim Shooter brought to comics that I did not appreciate as a kid in the single digits of life. Because he actually got fired the year I started reading comics. Or collecting comics, I should say. I've been reading comics since I was like 3 years old. They're a lot easier to read than actual prose books, of which I have many here, including this big one here. And maybe even a Harry Potter book like this one. So, Revlon bought it in 87. I started collecting in 87 with the Silver Surfer under Steve Englehart, who was a great writer. But my brother started collecting New Mutants, and he's a couple of years older than me, and we would take our newspaper money, because we had a newspaper route, and we would go and buy back issues, which were sometimes cheaper. Like we had a hard time choosing whether or not to buy an issue if it cost $1 or more for back issues. There were 2 comic book stores in our little city, so we'd go. We would only go to the nearer one, but then we started going to the one that was farther away, because that guy would actually talk to us about the ongoing stories and the old stories, and and there would be more people there
Memories.
hanging out. Yeah,
That were. Never mind. I won't interrupt you. Go
say
ahead.
it.
I was gonna say, my brother and I. Um, so again, my brother kind of got me into comics. He is about 4 years older than me, and he worked went from babysitting to working at like a retail store and stuff, and he was always good about saving his money. But when he collected comics,
Hmm.
and we used to go to the local flea market, and there was a guy there who had a ton of just random back issues of everything from Spawn to X-Men to Archie comics,
Hmm.
everything. And he sold them. He sold all the comics he sold. If they weren't set up in a special area, if they were just in the boxes, they were like 25 cents each, and that's where we got some of them. And my brother also bought a collection from a friend of mine in elementary school. He just bought a bunch. He bought like that guy's collection or whatever. But yeah, I remember 25 cents each, and it was hard because when I was a kid and started collecting comics, some of them were 75 cents each, and I remember when they went up to a buck, and then a buck 25 or 29, and then I won't go too much into it, but I remember for a period of time Marvel was coming out every month, and they had two different editions, a premium edition and a regular edition, and the premium edition was on the better paper, but it was like a buck 75 or a buck 99 as opposed to the
Yeah,
buck 25, and yeah,
that was
you remember
after
that.
Revlon. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the reason why I wanted to share this with you guys is to tell all you truckers out there about how I had to go through this young, very young. Um, the thing that we've talked about in the past is when a new creative team comes in on your story, whatever it is, they may not. We've talked about this, I think, on the newer episodes too, not just in the lost episodes. They may not continue the storyline that you had been reading. They may never finish it, and you're just kind of left hanging. And you can see it in television. You can see it in on movies. For not that you see it as often in movies, because movies tend to be one self-contained thing. But yeah, there are storylines that don't get finished. If anybody here watched Game of Thrones, which probably most people have, whatever happened to the what was it, the Dothraki fleet or whatever it was called that was supposed to come in and
The oh, are you talking about the
TV
Iron
show?
Fleet? Or you're talking about the Iron Fleet? Or are you talking about the Golden Company? Or are you talking about um,
How many of those storylines got finished?
finished or finished well?
Just there was I remember there was a big
For
fleet that was a major storyline, and I don't remember the name of it. And it was probably the Iron Fleet. I don't know, but there was a
it,
big
that
fleet that was
it did get finished, just not well.
okay. Fair enough.
It was just
Um,
forgotten about and then brought back.
if
It was
almost in
just bad.
passing. Fair
No,
enough.
kind of.
Um, there's just storylines that don't end up getting finished or don't get finished well when a new creative team comes on. And I had to learn that the hard way when I was in 19, it wasn't 87, because 87 is when Steve Englehart actually started, 86, I think he started the Silver Surfer. But Steve Englehart, his creative team with Ron Lim as the artist, just did the best Silver Surfer run, in my opinion, of all time was Volume 3, Issues 1 through roughly 30, 32, whatever it was, the Steve Englehart run. Steve Englehart leaves the book, and his friend Jim, oh, who's the guy who created Thanos? Just Jim Starlin. Thank you. Jim
You're
Starlin
welcome.
comes in. He takes over the book for about a year, and all of his time on the book is just leading into the Infinity Gauntlet saga, which wasn't a bad storyline, but the book stopped being about the Silver Surfer, and I almost stopped collecting. But then Ron Mars came and took over, and I'm still a kid here. I'm not even in high school yet. And Ron Mars came in and took over as he took over the writing duties for another probably 2 years, 3 years. Uh, and I kept reading, and it wasn't as good. And at the time as a kid, I didn't notice how different it was. I noticed it was different, but I was just starting to piece this together. As an adult, going back and rereading those comics, Ew, that Mars run was not very good. Um, it ignored a lot of continuity. The Surfer's power level keeps fluctuating wildly. It fluctuated a bit under Englehart, but it was to serve the story more than like why. Why is this he's suddenly unable to do this? You forgot about this. I was writing so Marvel Comics used to have a thing called the No Prize, and what the No Prize was is if you found a continuity error and you had a solution for it, you would you would write a letter to Marvel and you'd send it in. And if you won the No Prize, they would say, "Hey, you had the right continuity solution. We didn't even Most of the time they didn't even notice the mistake, but you had a great continuity solve there." And they sent you a sticker and a little congratulatory letter that was typed up for you, usually by an assistant editor. It was created by Stan the Man Lee himself, the No Prize. Well, they stopped giving out No Prizes after Revlon took over. I didn't know that until I sent in like 5 letters and they finally responded to one with, "Please stop sending us letters. We no longer do No Prizes." Yeah, that hurt. Not a lot, but as a kid, I'm like, but I had the perfect solution. I had like 5 or 6 of them. But that's what we like to do as geeks is discuss these things and try and figure out the loopholes. Like one of the famous ones in Star Trek is why the Klingons in the original series don't look like the Klingons in the Next Generation. And they mention that in the Trouble with Tribbles. I'm sorry, Trials and Tribulations in Deep Space Nine.
Deep Space Nine.
Yes,
We don't
and
talk about that.
that's it. They're like, was it a genetic mutation? Some kind of genetic virus? Was it genetic not mutation, manipulation, genetic engineering? Some kind of virus? We don't talk about that. That was it. But they mention it. They just put a lampshade on top of it and let it go. So the reason why I mentioned Chris Claremont at the beginning of all this is because Chris Claremont wrote the X-Men for 17 years. 17 years. They're actually bringing him back in a couple of months, believe it or not, to do more X-Men writing, to get us out of the Krakoa era. If you're following comics right now, you know what I'm talking about. If you don't, you're better off. Um, Sorry, that's about as negative as I want to get. Uh, if
It's
I did a
okay.
full critique of the current storyline, it would not be
I'll just put
positive.
it this way. I read stuff about it, and I'm like, it's not a good time for me to get back into X Men.
No, no, it is not. That stuff. Anyway, it wasn't as jarring in Silver Surfer when they changed creative teams. I don't know if they still had the same editor, or just a better editor, or just better writers, but when Chris Claremont left the X-Men, you could tell. Oh, you could tell. We still had Fabian Nicienza and what's his name, Rob Liefeld, writing X Force, and we lost the creative team on X Factor right at the same time. So right in 1991, so this is 4 years later, from 87 to 91. 1991, Chris Claremont, after 17 years, leaves the X-Men. Now, I've read that entire run, and it is fantastic. Most of the stories they pull for the movies for X-Men are variations on things Chris Claremont had a major hand in creating. Um, yeah, great stories, the classic versions of the characters. That's what they based the X-Men animated cartoon from the 90s on, which is X-Men 97 is going to be coming out this year, and there's lots of controversy about that already. They're changing the women's body shapes, especially Rogue's, to make them fit a different ideal. Yeah, there's other critiques, but that's one of the big ones is why are you doing this? This is what the character looked like. How are you going to explain that? Uh, Not going to get too much into that. I don't want to get too negative on an already negative video. So when Jim Starlin took over the book from Steve Englehart for Silver Surfer, Jim Starlin and Steve Englehart were friends. Jim Starlin and Steve Englehart were both writers at Marvel for over 10 years, and they had written variations on the Kree-Skrull War together a number of times. They knew each other's characters, they knew each other's writing style, and honestly, the problem with Jim Starlin's Silver Surfer wasn't that he was writing the Surfer poorly, it's that he was no longer the main character in his own book. Because Starlin was bringing back his own characters and setting up the Infinity Gauntlet, which he did a good job of that. And the Infinity Gauntlet was an interesting storyline, but it took out the Silver Surfer. And then Ron Mars comes in and doesn't know the Surfer that well, but it wasn't that jarring. He had done some research. He knew the history of the character enough to actually get it across that he knew who this character was. It wasn't it as a kid I noticed it, but I couldn't articulate it. As an adult I can articulate it, but and I would have noticed it immediately. But that's also this was one of my learning experiences for how bad that book got. And it wasn't terrible under Ron Mars. It just wasn't nearly as good as it was under Steve Englehart. Um, but when we get to the X-Men and a half, 17 years of writing these characters, 17 years of being the guy who created. He didn't create Wolverine. He defined Wolverine. Him and John Byrne really defined Wolverine, and then John Byrne stopped when because of creative differences, he left for other books. Um, and Wolverine was really defined first by Chris Claremont, and then by who wrote the X-Men? Most of those Wolverine comics, was that Bob Budiansky? Do you remember?
Uh, I'm not sure.
All
I
right, you
I joined in during the time, which might be the one you're talking about, but
if it was after '91, it was.
yeah, it was the Wolverine, and pretty much I called it the Wolverine Jubilee show because like it was like a year or 2 years where it was Wolverine traveling around with Jubilee, and I enjoyed those. It was they were
Those
actually
those
because
weren't bad
they
stories.
explored Jubilee's background and more and stuff like that. But anyways,
The Claremont wrote Claremont created Jubilee. Claremont and Jim
hmm
Lee created Jubilee, and Claremont defined the storyline where she joins the X-Men. It was really it was a good story. It took almost a year for from the introduction of Jubilee until she met the X-Men, and her little snippets were fun and interesting. And
wasn't she hiding from them in their own place or something like that?
eventually, yeah,
Yeah,
because the girls leave their Australian the base in the outback of Australia in the middle of a desert where there's nothing around for miles and miles, but their friend Gateway, who's a mutant who can do open teleportational portals, Gateway sends them to a mall in California to do
and
for
that's
a
where they meet
girls'
her.
night out. And Jubilee is hiding she's a mall rat before the movie ever came out, and Jubilee is hiding in the mall. And when the four women of the team of eight stop that whatever mutant or alien threat or whatever it was, the threat of the week there, she jumps in the portal after them, and they don't catch her. So that was Rogue, Psylocke,
Storm?
Dazzler, and Storm. Yeah.
Yeah. And the base in Australia they were in, that was an old Marauders base, if I remember correctly, right?
Yep. Yep. The Marauders, by the way, are cyborgs who fought the X-Men. They were minor, major villains. They were like mid-card villains of this wrestling. So again, with the Silver Surfer, wasn't a jerk of it. It wasn't a drastic change. It didn't jolt me into awareness. But when they changed creative teams on X-Men, it was like these people had never read who these characters were. You had 17 years where Wolverine went from an incredible hothead, almost borderline psychopath, to going through a long journey over those 17 years where we start seeing who he really that he starts becoming less feral, and by treating him like a human being, the X-Men brought out his human side instead of treating him like a barely restrainable animal, which was what Weapon X was doing, except for the Hudsons. Um, and Weapon X, by the way, is Canada's version of Shield. So you got to see the growth of Wolverine into becoming from this feral, barely constrained berserker to um, a brilliant. He could lead the team, but he often didn't. Solo, he could go solo. He could do his own thing. He could help the team. He could help out, and almost the X-Men's uncle, which is a position he's fulfilled pretty much since that point onward until the latest stuff. on the moon and Krakoa. And anyway, um, but it was jolting how much the characters actually changed in the storyline. They went from noble heroes to people who have problems that have either already been solved or were never a part of their storyline. It was a complete 180 in character, the most jolting of which was a few years later, more than a few years later, when Grant Morrison left his Justice League run and came and took over the X-Men. So I had left X-Men probably around the year 2000. I stopped reading. No, it was before that, probably around like 97, leaving high school, 96, 97. So, or even during high school, I couldn't read these characters anymore. When Colossus turned his back on Xavier's dream for no, it just didn't make sense. This is not the Colossus I had read 17 years worth of history for. It just wasn't. He wouldn't do that. And those things that happened, he wouldn't have made those decisions. He wouldn't have joined Magneto's acolytes. It didn't it didn't fit the character. And I
Which is
know,
funny because
go ahead.
that's when I started reading.
Yeah, it didn't make sense. Like Rusty and Skids, this is so esoteric. Rusty and Skids staying with the acolytes.
Hmm.
They wouldn't have done that. They just wouldn't have done that. They had been trying to get away from the Mutant Liberation Front, and when they get rescued by the acolytes and Magneto, they would have left. Magneto gave them the chance to leave, and they would have said, "You know what? We want to go see our friends again. We're not staying here to live in your new asteroid paradise. I knew Rusty and Skids. I read X Factor. I knew who these characters were." And Rusty in particular would never have. In fact, the fact that he stayed with the MLF as long as he did. No, wait, that was Skids because Rusty was sick. Sorry, it's been a while. Rusty wouldn't have stayed. He was a hero through and through. He was a paragon of virtue. He didn't start off that way, but being around somebody like Scott Summers and Bobby Drake, and to a lesser degree, Warren Worthington III and Hank McCoy and Jean Grey, um, these people did not compromise their values, their morality, their whatever you want to call it, ethics, whatever you want to call it. They didn't compromise that. And when they did, they regretted it and they learned their lesson from it. These characters had history behind them. They were dynamic. There was there was growth behind them. And that was ignored or just not known about for the sake of telling a story that wasn't as good as the old stories that created these characters in the first place. Yeah. So when that happened again, a few years later, in 1999, I believe Phantom Menace came out. Yeah. In 99, when the Phantom Menace came out, and people were like, Jar Jar Binks destroyed my childhood, and George Lucas has destroyed my childhood with what he did with this. I was already used to that. I'm like, look, it's a different creative team. George Lucas isn't who he was when he was, in his 20s making Star Wars for the first time. He's a grandfather now. His stories are not going to have the same sensibility. They might, but most people don't want to tell the same stories in their 60s that they told in their 30s and 20s. They're, they've grown, they've changed, and their stories reflect that. And it could have been if he had gotten different consultants in. One of the problems with the Phantom Menace is he surrounded himself with yes men. Of course, you're going to have to go far and wide to find somebody in Hollywood at that time period who was not a yes man for George Lucas because he was so very, very successful. So why would you tell him no? Even if you don't, and he was successful at doing things that nobody said would work. American Graffiti, that'll never work. Apocalypse Now, that'll never work. Not that that ended up being his movie, but that had started, that was one of his ideas, was Apocalypse Now, that Francis Ford Coppola took over uh, production on so he could get it done better, faster, and on time because the film company, Coppola's film company there, which name escapes me off the top of my head, Coppola's film company needed a win. So he took over Lucas's project and made it faster and hopefully better. It's a huge success, but George Lucas was the original director of that film. Uh, there's some pretty edgy stories he wanted to tell. There's not a lot of edge in the prequel trilogy. There's some, there's not a lot. And it comes from where he is after having done all these crazy things. Star Wars was never going to work. Anybody who was in the production of Star Wars said it would never ever work. Uh, or James Earl Jones agreed to do Star Wars, loved doing it, but he agreed to do it on the promise that he would get a flat fee of $3,800 in 1976, and that his name would not appear in the credits in any way, shape, or form because science fiction will ruin your career in the 70s until Star Wars. That's how much faith people had in him when he was doing things that will never work. So when it came time for somebody to question him 20 years later, nobody was questioning him. And that led to some problems with the prequels, which we're not going to get into. But I already knew what it was like. Creative teams come and creative teams go. The market drives success, which means success is in your hands, truckers. They're in my hands and in your hands, and Bews' hands too. Uh, we vote with our dollar. If we like a movie, we go and see it. If we don't like a movie, we don't go and see it. If we watch things on a streaming service that it gets more views, they're going to keep making shows in that of that style. So keep voting with your wallets. Pay attention to who's making stuff. That was one of the things I learned from all this was pay attention to who's making stuff. If you see Steve Englehart on a book, it's probably going to be a good read. It was his Batman stories that made the Dark Knight that they inspired the Dark Knight trilogy. That they took those. It was Steve Englehart stories that they based those off of. It was a lot of the stories that they made movies out of, and we're hitting 28 minutes, so I should probably 26, 27 minutes. I should probably wrap this up. Yeah, pay attention to your creative teams. Know who you like, know who you don't like. How do you feel about James Gunn making this new Superman movie? I've got mixed feelings on it. James Gunn has done some great stuff in the past, and he's done some not so great stuff in the past. And I've never seen him take on a serious character like Superman before. Maybe he has, and I just haven't seen it. But I like him when he does wacky. I like him when he does quirky. Is he going to be able to make Superman a model hero, which is who Superman is? I don't know. We'll see. All right. Thanks for sticking around, truckers.
All right, and we'll see you later. If I can find the button.
Keep up.